When I was 17, my mother took a lot of money from somewhere. I do not know the exact details, and I doubt I ever will, but what I do know is that it changed everything for us. She tried to keep it quiet at first, not making any big announcements or going on lavish spending sprees, but the signs were there. The first major thing she did was pay off my dad's debts. My parents had been divorced for years by then, and their relationship was, at best, complicated. Still, she took care of him in a way I do not think he ever expected, paying off what he owed and even buying him a small house so he could finally have some stability. She paid off her own debts too, ensuring that neither she nor my sister and I would have to carry the weight of financial burdens that had followed us for years. She also took care of my sister's college tuition in full, something that had been an ongoing concern before the money came in. And, to my surprise, she set up funds for me as well, ensuring that I would never have to worry about affording school or a place to live. Around this time, she had a boyfriend. He was a decent enough guy, I suppose, though I never really felt particularly close to him. He had a son who was about 7 at the time, and before I fully understood what was happening, they had moved into the new house my mom had bought for us. Over the next few years, I watched as my mom continued to provide for the people she loved. After my sister graduated college, my mom bought her a house of her own. She always wanted to make sure we were secure, that we had everything we needed to build our own futures without the constant stress of financial instability. Meanwhile, her boyfriend continued to live in our home, contributing nothing financially. He worked, but he did not pay rent, utilities, or any bills. My mom never asked him to. As far as I knew, she was happy to have him there. Then, when I was 21, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. It was bad. She sat my sister and me down and laid everything out clearly, exactly how much money was left, what her plans were for it, and how she wanted things handled after she was gone. The house, she told me, was to be mine. She had already provided for my sister, and now she wanted to make sure I was taken care of too. She made it clear that, while she loved her boyfriend, she was not leaving him anything directly. However, she did ask one thing of me. She asked if I would allow him and his son to stay in the house for a while, just until he got on his feet and found his own place. I agreed without hesitation. Before she passed, she spoke to him directly as well, making sure he understood the arrangement. She reminded him that he would need to start looking for his own place, but assured him that he had time to save. Then, she was gone. In the aftermath of her passing, I tried my best to honor her wishes. For the next 4 years, he and his son continued to live in the house. I paid all the bills, mortgage, electricity, water, everything, but I did not mind too much. We got along well enough, and he at least bought food for himself and his son. It felt like an acceptable arrangement, even if it was not exactly ideal. He dated occasionally, but for the most part, he kept his relationship separate from our home, something I respected. That was, until his current girlfriend entered the picture. The first 2 times she came over, I felt uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. She was just visiting, after all. It was not like she was moving in. But then, the 3rd time she came over, everything changed. That day, I was in the kitchen making myself some lunch, when she came walking downstairs, like she owned the place. She grabbed a plate, walked right up to the stove, and reached for my food. I stared at her in shock for a second before finally speaking. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She barely even looked at me as she responded, casually and dismissively. "I was just getting some food." I took a step closer, my stomach twisting in anger. "That's my food." She rolled her eyes, and then, without a hint of hesitation, said, "You really should start looking for somewhere else to live. Leeching off your dead mom's past relationship as an adult is pathetic." For a moment, I could not even process what I had just heard. It was so absurd, so wildly inappropriate, that my brain struggled to catch up. But then, the anger hit me like a tidal wave. I called for her boyfriend, my mom's old boyfriend. He came downstairs, his expression already wary, like he knew something was wrong. "I don't know what your current thing here thinks," I started, my voice shaking with rage, "but I'm not going to be disrespected in my own house." He would not look me in the eye. He mumbled something under his breath, something I almost did not catch, but when I did, it stopped me cold. "My mom promised you this house?" I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. He still would not meet my gaze. "She said I could stay," he muttered. That was a lie. A blatant, undeniable lie. My mom had made it explicitly clear, both to him and to me, that this house was mine. She had told him directly that he would need to find his own place, that he had time to save, but that he was not entitled to stay forever. And yet, here he was, trying to rewrite history, trying to claim that he was doing me a favor by letting me live in my own house. I was done. "You have 30 days to leave," I told him, my voice unwavering. "I'm not housing someone who lies and disrespects me in my house." He left that night, taking his son with him. I did not expect him to go so quickly, but I was not going to stop him. He had been here for nearly 8 years without paying a dime. If he had not saved up enough money by now to get his own place, that was entirely on him. But it did not end there. The next day, his ex-wife called me, furious. She accused me of being cruel, of being a heartless person for kicking out her son, for making him lose his house. I was stunned. His house? Her son had been here every other week for years, yes, but that did not make it his house. This house had belonged to my mother. Then, it had belonged to me. My mother had gone out of her way to ensure her boyfriend's son had a college fund, something that not even his own father had done for him. And yet, I was being painted as the villain for finally enforcing the boundaries my mom had set in the first place. To make matters worse, my sister chimed in as well, telling me that she felt like I was breaking my promise to our mom. And that stung. Because at the end of the day, I had tried to honor her wishes. I had given him years of free housing. But I could not shake the feeling that my mom had not expected him to still be here. That she had assumed he would have moved on long before now. So now, I am left wondering, was I wrong? Did I break my promise to my mom? Or was it always inevitable that I would eventually have to put my foot down and reclaim my home? Update 1. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I told him to leave, and I had started to settle into my own space again. The house felt different, quieter, lighter. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying just by having him here, by constantly tiptoeing around the situation, by letting my mom's old promise dictate my present. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe in my own home. Then, one evening, as the temperature started to drop and the first real signs of winter crept in, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something in my gut told me to check, and when I pulled the door open, there he was. My mom's old boyfriend stood on my porch, bundled up in a worn-out jacket, his son shivering slightly beside him. His eyes, which had refused to meet mine the last time we spoke, were finally looking at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something I hadn't seen before, genuine remorse. He apologized. He admitted that he had overstepped, that he had disrespected me, that what his girlfriend said was out of line. He told me he hadn't been able to find a place yet, that everything was either too expensive or wouldn't allow his son to stay with him part-time. He wasn't asking to move back in permanently, he just needed a place to stay for a little longer, just until he could figure things out. I wanted to slam the door in his face. I wanted to remind him that he had years, to save money, to plan for this, to prepare for the inevitable. But there was his son, standing beside him, rubbing his hands together for warmth, looking up at me with tired eyes. This kid had never done anything wrong. He didn't deserve to be homeless in the middle of winter because of his father's irresponsibility. So, I let them in. I made it clear that it was temporary, that this was not an invitation to settle back in. He swore it wouldn't be a problem, that he would be out as soon as possible, that he understood now what my mom's wishes actually were. He even offered to contribute something this time, pay part of the bills, buy more groceries, help around the house. I didn't trust him, not entirely, but I was willing to see if his actions would match his words. At first, things seemed okay. He kept his distance, mostly staying in the guest room with his son. He didn't bring his girlfriend over, and he actually started pulling his weight a little, buying food for the house, cleaning up after himself, keeping to himself when I was home. For the first time since my mom passed, I thought that maybe, just maybe, he actually understood. But of course, nothing ever stays that simple. The first incident happened about a week after he moved back in. I came home late from work one evening and immediately felt like something was off. The house was dark, quiet, but I could hear faint sounds coming from the living room. As I stepped inside, I caught sight of movement on the couch, his girlfriend. She was lounging there like she had every right to be, scrolling through her phone with her feet up on my coffee table. There was an empty takeout container sitting beside her, and a half-full glass of wine balanced on the armrest. The sheer audacity of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching as she continued to act like this was her home, like she had just moved in alongside him, like nothing had changed. And then, as if sensing me, she finally looked up. "Oh," she said, her voice as smug as ever. "Didn't hear you come in." I didn't respond. I turned, walked down the hall, and knocked on his door. He answered almost immediately, looking half guilty, half exhausted. "I told her not to come," he said before I even spoke. I didn't care. I told him she needed to leave, that if he wanted to stay here even temporarily, she was not welcome. He hesitated, but in the end, he woke her up and they left together, muttering to each other under their breath as they walked out into the cold night. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, it happened again. This time, I walked into the kitchen one morning and found a half-eaten breakfast on the counter. At first, I thought it was his son's, but then I noticed something else, her shoes, carelessly kicked off near the door. She had stayed the night. I confronted him immediately. He swore it was an accident. She had come over late, and he didn't have the heart to send her back out into the cold. It wouldn't happen again, he promised. But it did. 2 nights later, I woke up around midnight and heard voices coming from the backyard. I peeked through the blinds and saw them, him, his girlfriend, and a few of their friends, all laughing, drinking, talking like they were at some kind of casual house party. I hadn't even known they were in my house. They hadn't asked, hadn't mentioned anything, just invited people over like it was their home. That was the final straw. The next morning, I packed his things. I didn't care where he went, what he did, whether he had found an apartment yet or not. He had broken my trust for the last time. When he saw the bags by the door, he didn't argue. He didn't even try to apologize. He just sighed, nodded, and started packing up the rest of his things. I never heard from his girlfriend again. But a few days later, his ex-wife called me, again. This time, her anger was even worse. She accused me of kicking out her son again, of being cruel and selfish, of breaking some kind of unwritten moral code. I told her the truth, that I had given him another chance, that I had done everything I could, but that he had made his choices. She didn't care. I hung up on her. In the end, he found a place, not too far away. A small apartment, nothing fancy, but enough. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that his girlfriend didn't last much longer after that. She left him a month later, apparently unhappy with how things turned out. And me? I finally had my house back. For the first time in years, it felt like mine again. No unwanted guests, no lingering tension, no walking on eggshells. Just me, in the home my mom left me, finally at peace. And you know what? It felt really damn good. Update 2. The days following his final departure were strange. The house was quiet again, peaceful, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. At first, I thought that would be the end of it, that I would move on, that everyone else would accept what happened and do the same. But, of course, people love to have opinions about things that don't concern them. It started with the calls. My sister was the first. She didn't outright call me cruel, but it was there, laced between her words, in the way she spoke to me like I had done something shameful. She told me I should have been more patient, that he was still grieving in his own way, that he had lost the woman he loved just as much as we had lost our mother. She acted like I had ripped something away from him, like I had thrown him into the cold without a second thought. I didn't entertain the argument. Because here's the thing, I did give him a second chance. I gave him years of free housing, of not paying a single bill, of existing in this house without contributing anything beyond whatever groceries he decided to bring in for himself and his son. Then, when I told him to leave, I still let him back in when he needed it. I gave him time. I gave him another chance. And what did he do with that chance? He disrespected me, broke my trust, and invited his new girlfriend into my house, like it was his to offer. So no, I didn't feel guilty. But people sure as hell wanted me to. His ex-wife called again. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail this time, going on about how her son was struggling to adjust, how I had been heartless to kick them out in the dead of winter, how I had no idea what it was like to be a single parent trying to make things work. I deleted the voicemail without even listening to the rest of it. Then came the friends. Or, I guess, people who claimed to be my mom's friends. People who I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had so much to say. They told me I was being selfish, that my mom had loved him, that she would have wanted me to take care of him. One even had the audacity to say that my mother would have been ashamed of me for throwing him out like that. I didn't care. I didn't need to justify myself to anyone. But the most frustrating part? Some of my own relatives chimed in. Distant aunts, cousins, people who had never offered to help, who had never stepped in when my mom was sick, who had never once asked if I needed anything after she passed. And yet, suddenly, they were full of opinions. He just needed time to adapt after losing your mom. He was trying to rebuild his life. You should have been more understanding. Oh, should I? Should I have been more understanding when he let his girlfriend insult me in my own kitchen? Should I have been more patient when she started making herself at home, helping herself to my food, my space, acting like I was the one who didn't belong? Should I have let him keep sneaking her in, keep pushing my boundaries, keep disrespecting the very house my mother left to me? Because I'll tell you one thing, I didn't see any of them offering him a place to stay. But the thing that really sealed it for me, the thing that made me realize just how much I had dodged a bullet, was when I found out what he did next. A few months passed, and despite all the drama, I was finally settling back into a routine. Then, one day, I ran into someone who used to work with my mom. She wasn't someone I was particularly close to, but she had always been kind, always had a warm smile whenever we crossed paths. She looked surprised to see me and, after a little small talk, she hesitated before saying, "So, how's Mom's boyfriend doing?" I almost laughed out loud. Why was she asking me? As far as I was concerned, he was no longer my problem. I just shrugged and said, I wouldn't know. And that's when she told me what she heard. Apparently, after he left my house, he did find a place. It was a small apartment, nothing fancy, but enough to get by. And he wasn't alone. His new girlfriend, the same one he had brought into my house like she owned the place, had moved in with him immediately. Not only that, but she wasn't just staying with him. She was financially supporting him. Let that sink in for a second. This man, who had spent years living rent-free in my house, who had never contributed a single cent to the mortgage, who had people lining up to defend him, had moved directly from my home into another situation where someone else was footing the bill for him. And the best part? She broke up with him a few months later. According to the same source, he had started slacking off again. He wasn't pulling his weight, wasn't helping around the apartment, wasn't contributing financially. Sound familiar? Well, apparently, she got sick of it a lot faster than I did. She kicked him out, and he ended up bouncing from couch to couch, staying with whoever would take him in. And that was when the calls stopped. The same relatives who had been so quick to call me cruel? The same friends who had tried to guilt-trip me? They weren't saying a damn thing anymore. Why? Because they finally saw what I already knew. This wasn't a grieving man trying to get back on his feet. This was someone who had learned to survive off the generosity of others. And I had cut him off. I never spoke to him again after that. I never reached out, never checked in, never had another conversation with him. He was gone from my life, and I was finally free of the weight he had brought with him. I kept the house. I made it my own again. I got rid of anything that reminded me of that period, repainted the walls, redecorated, turned it into my space. My mother's house became my home, just as she had wanted. And despite what anyone else had to say, despite the people who tried to make me feel guilty, I never once regretted the decision I made. Because at the end of the day, I owed him nothing. After everything settled, after the call stopped and the drama faded into the background, I finally had the chance to sit down and process it all. There were moments when I wondered if I had done the right thing, if maybe I had been too harsh, too quick to cut him out completely. But then, I would remember everything, the years of taking up space in my house without contributing, the constant disrespect, the entitled attitude, and of course, the way he had tried to rewrite history to make himself look like a victim. I owed him nothing. And yet, for so long, I had let guilt keep me from acting. At first, I thought the guilt came from my mom's wishes. I had agreed to let him stay after she passed, and in some way, I felt like it was a promise I had broken. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my mom had never intended for him to stay forever. She had given him time, not a permanent home. The only thing I had done wrong was waiting too long to reclaim what was mine. But what stuck with me the most was how quickly people had been willing to defend him. The sheer number of friends, family, and even acquaintances who had something to say about my decision was overwhelming. Most of them weren't even people who had been involved in our lives when my mom was sick. They weren't there when I was watching her deteriorate, when I was listening to her final wishes, when I was holding her hand in those last moments. And yet, they had no problem judging me for a decision that, in the end, wasn't theirs to make. I started thinking about how often this happens, how often people, especially women, are expected to take on burdens that don't belong to them. How many times have we been told to be understanding, to be patient, to put other people's needs before our own? How often are we called selfish the moment we set a boundary? I thought about the countless times I had heard stories of people stuck in similar situations, women who let their partner's family move in, only to end up being treated like an outsider in their own home. People who took in struggling friends, only to be used and disrespected. Family members who were guilt-tripped into supporting relatives that had no intention of ever standing on their own 2 feet. I had seen it happen to other people. I had let it happen to myself. And I was done with it. So, I took my life back. First, I made some changes to the house. It wasn't just about redecorating, it was about reclaiming it. I painted the walls, got rid of the furniture that had been his, changed every little thing that reminded me of those years. The guest room, the one he had stayed in for so long, became a home office. The living room, where his girlfriend had once made herself comfortable like she owned the place, was rearranged to make it feel like mine again. I changed the locks, not because I thought he would come back, but because I wanted to erase any trace of his presence. And then, I focused on myself. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of other people's expectations, bending over backward to avoid conflict, to keep the peace, to do what I thought my mom would have wanted. But I realized that my mom wouldn't have wanted me to spend years of my life sacrificing my happiness for someone who wasn't even grateful. She wouldn't have wanted me to let guilt dictate my decisions. She had spent so much of her life trying to make sure my sister and I had everything we needed. The least I could do was live a life that honored that. So, I let go. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening. I stopped justifying my choices to people who weren't living my life. The people who truly cared about me, the ones who actually mattered, they understood. And the ones who didn't? They were never really on my side to begin with. Looking back, I can't believe I let it go on for as long as I did. But I also know that sometimes, we need time to see things clearly. When you're in the middle of something, it's easy to convince yourself that you're doing the right thing by keeping the peace, by avoiding confrontation, by being the bigger person. It's only when you step away that you realize how much of yourself you've given away in the process. I don't regret what I did. If anything, I wish I had done it sooner. Because at the end of the day, my home is mine again. My life is mine again. And that is worth more than any false sense of obligation could ever be.